If you think of the most likely people to have experiences with other life forms, it's people who spend time in outer space. Because not only are they actively exploring the unknown, but they also understand the laws of the universe and have more knowledge of how things should look up there. That's why when astronauts encounter unidentified crafts, those cases are especially interesting. And according to former NASA astronaut Scott Carpenter, at no time when the astronauts were in space were they alone. There was a constant surveillance by UFOs. But hundreds of people are involved in space exploration, not just the astronauts. And even though they haven't been to outer space, they often have their own stories to share of things they have observed. So from astronauts who have witnessed things in orbit they cannot explain, to a NASA worker who has retold many stories that were told to him during his career, regarding aliens and other life visitations. Here are 5 astronauts and NASA employees whose experiences, stories and encounters with UFOs or aliens will create some serious debate. Donald Slayton. Donald Slayton was an American World War II pilot, aeronautical engineer and test pilot who went on to be selected as one of the original NASA Mercury 7 astronauts. Unfortunately, he was unable to fly the mission due to an irregular heartbeat. However, Donald did serve as NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations from 1963 to 1972, and was eventually given medical clearance, and in 1975 was assigned as docking module pilot on Apollo's Soyuz test project. The flight was a success, and by now, Donald was very well regarded in the world of aeronautics, and not a man to make things up. So when he talked openly about an encounter with a UFO, not whilst in orbit, but whilst flying an aeroplane, enthusiasts took note and became even more convinced that his story was proof they were looking for. I couldn't say it better than the man himself, so take a listen to an interview Donald gave.
As I closed on this thing, well, it looked like a weather balloon, and that's what I presumed it was. And I had plenty of gas and time, so I decided I'd just come back around and make a pass on it. And I got around where I should have been coming back on this thing. All of a sudden, it didn't look like a balloon anymore. It looked like a saucer sitting on edge, about a 45-degree angle. I didn't have any gun camera film on board, unfortunately, or I'd have shot some pictures of it. And about that time, I guess whatever it was, for whatever reason, just took off climbing at about a 45-degree angle and just accelerated and disappeared. And I obviously couldn't follow it with an old piston engine fighter. So I turned around and went home.
Pretty interesting. I wish we knew more about it. But what are your thoughts? Joseph A. Walker. Joseph Walker, like Donald Slayton, was a US World War II pilot who went on to become a NASA test pilot, who was one of the first astronauts to report a UFO. In 1960, Joseph became the first NASA pilot to fly the X-15, which was one of the fastest manned experimental test planes ever flown, attaining speeds of 5,000 miles per hour and altitudes exceeding 100,000 feet. It was the first manned aircraft to transition from the Earth's atmosphere to the very edges of space, and then re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and land. Walker did this without the modern-day onboard assistance of flight computers that automatically adjust the spacecraft in flight. He later claimed that one of his tasks as an X-15 pilot was to detect UFOs, and during his record-breaking 50-mile flight in April 1962, he filmed at least 5 objects that he could not explain. He even went on to make a public statement claiming these objects were pacing his high-speed spaceplane. Although NASA were quick to give an official version of what Walker had seen, and explained that what he had witnessed was frozen fuel or ice that had broken off the X-15's fuselage, and was floating alongside the craft. However, Walker disagreed with this. After all, he was there, and on a subsequent mission, he claimed to have seen and filmed more objects that he could not identify. During a lecture at the Second National Conference on the Peaceful Uses of Space Research in Seattle, Washington, he said, "I don't feel like speculating about them. All I know is what appeared on the film was developed after the flight." To date, the film has never been released to the public, and sadly, Walker was killed in 1966 when his F-104 Starfighter collided with an XB-7 Valkyrie at an altitude of 25,000 feet. Leroy Chiao. Leroy Chiao is an engineer and former NASA astronaut who flew on 3 space shuttle flights and was the commander of Expedition 10. He even lived on board the International Space Station from October 13, 2004 to April 24, 2005. It was during this, on the ISS, that he took a spacewalk with fellow cosmonaut Salizhan Shaparov when something caught Chiao's attention. He described it as some lights that seemed to be in a line, almost like an upside down check mark, that was awfully strange. Shaparov was facing the opposite way, so did not witness the event. After reporting it, an explanation has been offered for Chiao's sighting, with claims that he witnessed the bright lights of a line of fishing boats strung along the South American coast, although many say this seems highly unlikely. Chiao himself is skeptical, but will not 100% rule out the possibility that we have been visited by aliens from another planet. He has been quoted as saying the following: "If there is life out there that's so much more advanced than we are, and they know either how to travel great distances in short amounts of time, or they are able to come from a parallel universe into ours, why don't they just come and show themselves?" Clark McClelland. Now, this is a bit of a wild card. Clark McClelland was a former NASA employee who has worked in close contact with astronauts for most of his life, and he has made some controversial claims over the years. In 1991, Clark recounted that he was monitoring a space mission along with his colleagues at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, when he spotted what he calls an entity. He claims it was two-legged, standing around 8 to 9 feet tall, and approached the US astronaut inside a shuttle, although he will not name who they were. Clark then claimed he saw an unrecognizable craft hovering behind the shuttle. In another case, Clark says astronaut Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka had told him about footage that he had seen of the ETs that landed at Roswell, as well as dead bodies of other aliens. He claims Onizuka and other astronauts were shown footage of a medical room and several small bodies lying on slabs. They were humanoid in shape and were similar in appearance to those described by witnesses to the Roswell incident. Large heads, large eyes, small bodies, and thin arms and legs. Sadly, Onizuka died in the 1986 Challenger space shuttle disaster, so cannot confirm these claims. Clark maintains that astronauts are shown this Roswell footage to prepare them in case they encounter such beings on their missions. Now, what is strange about Clark is that he confirms to have been a former NASA spacecraft operator, and has photographs and written testimonies from former astronauts to prove it. But if you check out NASA's website, he is not listed anywhere, which is unusual as they keep records of their former employees. When Clark was asked about the lack of official records of his time with NASA, this was his response: "History is created, manipulated, and written by those who are predominantly on the victorious side of the nation, which has supreme political, and especially military dominance. Any truth, which has the slightest potential of weakening their total hold over the masses, is not tolerated." Make of that what you will, and maybe Clark is spreading false encounters, but he is definitely an interesting man. What do you make of his stories? Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Dean Mitchell was a United States naval officer and NASA astronaut who was the lunar module pilot of Apollo 14, becoming the 6th person to walk on the moon. However, he was also known for his controversial and outspoken beliefs about extraterrestrials, UFOs belonging to aliens, and a possible government cover-up. In particular, the Roswell incident of 1947. Edgar claims that he was told by descendants of the original Roswell witnesses, including one of the children of the deputy sheriff who was patrolling the area at the time of the incident, as well as the person who was responsible for delivering the so-called child-sized coffins to the base. He claims they all confirmed alien bodies were found, and he believes their stories were credible. He also claims it was covered up because officials deemed the public was not ready to handle such information. Despite his beliefs, Edgar admitted he had never actually seen aliens himself, although he had publicly expressed his opinion that he was 90% sure that the thousands of UFOs recorded since the 1940s belonged to visitations from other planets. For many years, Edgar continued to give interviews and write books on his beliefs. And in 2015, he made headlines when he claimed it was aliens, not diplomacy, that prevented the Cold War from turning into World War III. He also maintained that the White Sands missile range in New Mexico is a testing ground for atomic weapons, and that extraterrestrials were keen to know more about the Earth's military capabilities, as they wanted to prevent us from going to war. In more recent years, Edgar urged government officials to reveal the truth, and it was suggested by WikiLeaks that he regularly met up with Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman, John Podesta, to discuss UFOs and the possibility of a space war. Although some of his stories seem pretty unrealistic, this guy certainly doesn't lack intelligence, and you can't help but wonder if there is any truth behind his stories. So there's 5 astronauts and NASA workers who have witnessed UFOs and possible visitations by another life form, or who have been in the loop of astronauts and have some incredible stories to tell. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the series, and I'll see you in the next one.